Okay, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to demystify the incredible second-by-second weather system operating inside your brain when you try to speak a new language. If you've ever felt like your language skills just vanish the exact moment you actually need them, I promise you are not alone, and today, we're going to break down the exact science behind why that happens.
You know that sudden panicky feeling, right? You know a word perfectly well in practice, but the second you're put on the spot in a real conversation, poof, it's gone. You're chatting away, feeling confident, and then, bam, your mind just goes totally blank. So why does our ability to communicate fluctuate so wildly from one moment to the next?
To understand exactly why this happens, we're going to explore complex dynamic systems theory. We'll be hitting 6 main points today. First, the language butterfly effect. Second, willingness to communicate. Third, the idiodynamic method. Fourth, we'll take a look inside the learner's mind. Fifth, attractors and repellers. And finally, rethinking how we learn.
Part 1, the language butterfly effect. So, a lot of us grew up thinking language learning is kind of like building a static brick wall. You cement a vocab word here, a grammar rule there, and it just stays put. But dynamic systems theory flips that completely. It tells us that speaking a language is actually a lot more like navigating a chaotic, unpredictable weather system. Researchers like Debat outline 4 key properties for these systems. They change over time, and absolutely everything is interconnected. They also self-organize into preferred and unpreferred states. But the real kicker is number 4, non-linearity, better known as the butterfly effect. In our brains, this means a tiny little drop in vocabulary recall. Literally just forgetting one single word can trigger a massive hurricane of anxiety that collapses your entire ability to speak in that exact moment.
Moving right along to Part 2, willingness to communicate.
And that hurricane of anxiety brings us to a really critical concept called willingness to communicate, or WTC. Now, WTC isn't just some general overarching attitude. It's your immediate, real-time intention to either speak up or stay silent the second an opportunity arises. For the longest time, researchers relied on what psychologist Gordon Allport called a nomothetic approach. Basically, they treated communication like a static personality trait, like, oh, are you generally an extrovert or an introvert? But researchers Peter McIntyre and James Legato realized that didn't quite capture the whole picture. So they championed an idiodynamic approach, proving that your confidence is actually a highly fluid wave. You aren't just universally confident or anxious when you speak, your brain is rapidly ping-ponging between both states, constantly reevaluating the situation second by second.
Which leads us to Part 3, the Idiodynamic Method. So how on earth do you actually measure a feeling that changes in a fraction of a second? Well, McIntyre and Legato came up with this really ingenious 4-step methodology. Step 1, they record learners doing a standard communication task. Think describing a painting or just counting out loud. Step 2, the learners actually sit down, watch the video of themselves, and use custom software to dynamically rate their own fluctuating confidence. They literally click a mouse to raise or lower their WTC score in real time. Step 3 is a stimulated recall discussion. They pause the video at the big spikes and drops and ask, hey, what exactly were you feeling right here? And finally, Step 4, the whole session gets meticulously transcribed.
Let's dive into Part 4, inside the learner's mind.
Let's actually look at the emotional heartbeats of these students to see this theory in action. Take Mabel's data, for instance. Her willingness to communicate absolutely tanks. It crashes from a +4 all the way down into the negative zone during Task 7. And keep in mind, Task 7 wasn't some intense philosophical debate. She was literally just counting to 100 by tens in French. So what exactly caused this massive system collapse?
Well, the transcription from that moment brilliantly illustrates exactly what happened. She's sailing along perfectly, 10, 20, 30, but then she hits 80. And she just completely, frustratingly, blanks on the French word for 80. She actually spends over 60 seconds just trying to retrieve this one single word, saying things like, oh my God, I can't believe I can't remember that. This is the butterfly effect in action, guys. One tiny vocabulary glitch causes an instant system collapse, dragging her entire willingness to communicate right down with it.
But what's really fascinating is how different brains handle these exact same glitches. If we contrast Mary's experience with Sue's results, you can see just how uniquely every single learner's mind organizes itself. Both of them experienced sudden surges of anxiety, but Mary managed to push through. She recovered her willingness to speak and found ways to cope with her anxiety mid-sentence. Sue, on the other hand, felt so discouraged by a tough moment on one task that she let that negative momentum carry over, eventually abandoning the following tasks entirely.
That brings us to Part 5, attractors, repellers, and change.
So what are the invisible forces driving these wild spikes and flatlines? Why do we bounce back, or why do we just give up? In dynamic systems theory, this comes down to what we call attractor and repeller states. When your linguistic system, your vocabulary and your grammar, and your emotional system are working smoothly together, you naturally settle into an attractor state. It's a preferred state. The words are flowing, you're feeling good, and your system naturally wants to stay right there. But the second a word fails you, or you feel a threat to your self-esteem, your system wants to avoid that discomfort at all costs. You immediately drop into a repeller state, an unpreferred state, where you just shut down and stop talking.
So what exactly shoves us back and forth between these two states? Researchers narrowed it down to a few key factors. The absolute biggest one is the ease of vocabulary retrieval. If a word comes to you quickly, boom, your willingness to communicate spikes. If it doesn't, it plummets. Simple as that. But it's also heavily tied to ongoing monitoring. You see, the brain's cognitive resources are incredibly limited. Doing the heavy lifting of frantically searching for a word while simultaneously double-checking your own grammar can instantly overheat your working memory and completely drain your willingness to speak.
And finally, Part 6, Rethinking How We Learn.
Let's zoom out for a second and look at how all of this completely reshapes our understanding of language acquisition. We really have to stop viewing learning and speaking as two completely separate events. As pioneer Diane Larson Freeman points out, it's not that you learn a language and then you use it. It's actually in the using that you learn. The two are completely inseparable. Every single time you push through that mid-sentence anxiety, you are actively reorganizing your brain's dynamic system in real time.
It is a deeply, deeply complex process. Psychologist David Funder beautifully captures this, noting that, quote, many different things are going on at the same time within the typical human head and heart, end quote. When you're trying to speak a new language, you aren't just reciting data like a robot. You are desperately negotiating a highly complex emotional and cognitive compromise. You're balancing conflicting goals, fighting off cognitive overload, and managing your emotions in a continuous, second-by-second struggle for a workable outcome.
Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder. If you start understanding that your confidence isn't some fixed, permanent trait, but rather a fleeting event, like a passing storm in a dynamic weather system, how is that going to change the way you approach your very next conversation? The next time you freeze up, just remember, it is absolutely not a flaw in your personality. It's just a momentary butterfly effect in your cognitive weather system. So take a deep breath, let the storm pass, and just keep talking.